orchestrate this while
Yep.
you're...
Okay, good afternoon. We are having the Rotary Wash E-Club Gender, Power, and Social Change Forum. Tiffany Cohn is our presenter, and I'm going to have her introduce herself and the topic that she'll be presenting today. Tiffany?
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to lead this discussion today, and I hope I can raise some interesting questions by the end of it. So essentially how I've structured this, I'll just give you a bit of an idea about my own background, and then talk about AUW, which is the university that I work at the moment, specifically its mission and educational structure, because it has a lot to do with very much around empowering women is one of its central aims. Talk a little bit about the courses that I teach and the emphasis on ethnography that is very much part of what I teach. Raise some issues around culture and gender, or just point out some interesting connections between the two, and then talk about the role of ethnographic research in development work. So that's the overall structure of this. So as far as my own background, I'm trained in anthropology. So I'm actually from Otago originally, and then I did my doctoral studies in Australia at ANU. My fieldwork actually was in China, and it was focused on religious leadership specifically, but I have interests in cross-cultural psychology, self-cultivation, how people make meaning in the world, and also applied anthropology and development. So I'm currently teaching at AUW in Chittagong, Bangladesh at the moment, and I've been there for almost 3 years, coming up 3 years. So AUW, the Asian University for Women, is an independent international university in Chittagong, Bangladesh. So it's right down the bottom in a big port city. And it's really seeking to educate a new generation of leaders in Asia, of female leaders in Asia. So it takes in students on the basis of merit, so regardless of their family's income level. And nearly all the students that are there are on full scholarship, with many of them being the first in their family to attend university. So a lot of them are coming from families where they are really breaking new ground in terms of their own education. So currently we have more than 700 students at the Institute, and they're coming from about 15 countries across Asia and the Middle East. So right now we actually have a lot of students particularly from Afghanistan and Syria. But throughout, we've got Burma and Vietnam and parts of China, more remote parts of China, and then obviously a large contingent from Nepal, India, and Bangladesh as well. So it's incredibly diverse place to be in a diverse classroom to be connected to. So this is just to give you a little bit of context about where it is. So that's Chittagong, right there next door to Myanmar. Okay, and these are just some photographs to give you some context too. So this was a couple of years ago. This was a filmmaking course that I taught. This was right at the end of semester. So this is just one of those last classes photographs taken right at the end in the same group. And then these are just some photographs from the region. So this is up on the border with India, up the top of Bangladesh, on the border with India. And you can see people collecting rocks from the bottom of the lake there that goes up to the border. And then this is down in Chittagong. This is near the port itself, but this is just looking out onto the Bay of Bengal in Bangladesh. This is on the way to work on a very hot day in Bangladesh too. Okay. So I just wanted to mention some of the projects that AUW is working on with the students, and also some of the common barriers that many of the young women obviously face that we're working with. So obviously, as I've said, the primary mission is to empower women through education. I've put empower women in quotation marks just because it is it's a very culturally specific idea as well about what it actually means to empower someone, and it's different in different contexts as well. But many of the graduates that I've worked with and that I've known have gone on to become leaders in their home communities and working for NGOs and local government branches and things. So it's very interesting to watch how they're kind of going out into the world and affecting change in terms of gender as well. Some of the interesting projects that AUW runs, Women Across Borders, is a club run by the university which aims to make basic education available to children unable to attend regular schools. So this is really run by the students. So a lot of the young women are going out into Chittagong, mainly the local communities in Chittagong, and working with young children, sometimes gathering children on the street or working with local NGOs and running classes on like menstruation or on aspects of literacy, basic literacy, or running art classes, that sort of thing. So it's students really taking it into their own hands and going out and providing basic education. The Aparajita Literacy Program provides basic literacy in both Bangla and English to service staff at AUW, so all of the cleaning staff that we have. Often some of them don't actually, they've had very little education in their own native language as well, but they'd also like to be able to communicate with a lot of the foreign staff. So we have a program that works with them to teach them basic literacy. And currently this has been going for about a year and a half, but this is a Pathways for Promise program which provides pre-undergraduate training to young women from garment factories. So where there's a big influx of probably about 120 or so students that finished schooling at the age of 11 or 12 and then have been working in the garment factories. And so through a process of testing, they have to sit an admissions test, etc. But then that we're providing sort of pre-undergraduate training in a way. And if they can manage to get through that, then they can get entrance into the first year undergraduate program. So obviously a lot of barriers, there are many barriers that women face throughout this region, Bangladesh and also the surrounding countries. So early marriage is a huge problem in Bangladesh itself. And we've had some problems at the university around that as well. There are strong gender norms, obviously, and a lot of cultural expectations around what's expected of young women. So if some young women don't conform to, certain trajectories in their life, then they can often be met with a lot of stigma from their families, but also from their friend groups as well. Many of them are coming from low-income families, so in order for them to, fund postgraduate study or fund internships or go overseas for a semester or these sorts of things, a lot of the students do their own crowdfunding to do that. So there's this very strong entrepreneurial spirit among the students that I work with as well. And obviously very, very patriarchal culture. So Bangladesh itself is extremely patriarchal as well, and Afghanistan and many of these countries, Pakistan, etc. So this is something that the women are very aware of, and they also have to walk a fine line between all the things they're kind of being taught at the university and then returning to their home communities and having to reintegrate these ideas and communicate them to their home communities as well, which is not an easy thing to do necessarily. So I just wanted to give a sense of what the curriculum is, because it's in Bangladesh, it's a private university, and it's quite distinct from, the curriculum is quite distinct from what's on offer elsewhere. So it follows an American system. So the idea being that all students, no matter what major they choose, they all have to complete a certain number of undergraduate liberal arts credits. So they have to do courses in social analysis, in literature, civilization studies, society and arts, and ethical reasoning, maths and science, writing seminars, and regional challenge courses. So the regional challenge is where they really need to take some of the theoretical knowledge that I might have learnt and apply it. It might be an environmental science, for example, and apply that to a specific challenge in a specific location. It could be in Bangladesh, or it could be in another country in the region. So there's very much an emphasis in the university on leadership, on cultivating leadership, but also on always using what you're doing in the classroom in a real world sense. So we all in the class, we're always trying to emphasize that quite a lot in terms of outcomes, and also internships. There's a lot of opportunities for internships. So again, this is the whole idea of applying research projects and study programs to make sure that they can transition into something quite quickly out of undergraduate life. I have a lot of students at the moment who are working for a NGO in Dhaka, and they're doing a lot of environmental related issues, such as creating parklets, so car-free areas in the city, and promoting urban gardening, reducing the use of plastic, and so on. So that NGO is doing a lot of great work at a very, very local level in trying to implement some of these changes. And also, obviously, students are going to organizations like BRAC. BRAC is a very, very large NGO in Bangladesh, but it's also in Afghanistan as well. Daughters for Life program and the Grameen Bank, which you might have heard of, which was set up to give microcredit to women to sort of give them a starting economic basis on which they could build. So there's a lot of activity going on, a lot of very interesting development work, really, that's being done by students themselves out in the community. This is just a quick impression of all the courses that I've been currently teaching over the last 3 years or so. So you can see the general theme. There's an ethnographic kind of theme running through all of those. I'll just run to this. So in terms of what I'm focusing on here, in terms of gender and power and social change, probably the two most relevant courses that I teach are applied anthropology and contemporary issues, where in the course we're looking at issues of overconsumption, poverty and conflict, and overpopulation as three very big themes, and then trying to apply principles of the ethnographic method to solving some of these, or helping to tackle some of these. So the course really emphasizes the importance of the ethnographic approach in more deeply understanding and measuring the effectiveness of development initiatives. And then the writing ethnography course is really a research methods course, but the students have to go out and do a piece of research, and so that's also very beneficial too, because they're having to look at contemporary issues that are happening right now and conduct some social science informed research on that. So some of the topics that I've had have been eve teasing, so sexual harassment, improving contraception rates, birth control rates by educating both men and women. So students have lots of ideas around how that could be better managed, and much more, not so much about just targeting the women, but actually integrating the men into that conversation as well. Exploring LGBT issues in Indonesia. So that's also a big topic of interest to the students too, about gender fluidity and how people who don't belong to either binary, place themselves in the society. So those two courses. And right now I'm beginning three different projects. One is related to water. It's around, obviously, the treatment of water is of huge concern to everybody, and the water in Chittagong is not treated particularly well, like nowhere in South Asia really. But I was just going to follow up with that by doing a cross-cultural study of water around what the values, like why is it cultural that water is treated in a certain way, or is it purely circumstantial and just it's been going on for so long. So what I mean by that is that, like, water is as you've seen by the Ganges River and things, many things are thrown into the water. It's seen as sacred and holy on the one hand, and yet it's incredibly, incredibly polluted on the other. So it seems like a bit of a contradiction there. The second one is more related to mental health, which is also a huge discourse at the moment throughout the world. But in terms of the barriers to the treatment of and the perceptions around mental health disorders in South Asia, is something of interest. And the third one is about forced migration and trauma. So obviously the refugee narrative, which is refugee crisis, which is very much present and very, very urgent at the moment, has been for quite some time. So looking at that amongst some of the community at the university, but also there's the Rohingya crisis, which is just a couple of hours down the road from where we are as well. So that's very much occupying the students' minds too. So it'd be good to look more deeply into that as well. Okay, so that's a lot of context. So I guess I just wanted to make some connections here between culture and gender and connect that to development somehow and get your thoughts on that. So in anthropology, culture, the very idea of culture has been debated for decades and decades, and there have been multitudes of definitions of what culture is, what should we include, what should we not include, how should we define it, etc. To the point where at one point anthropologists decided that they weren't going to use the word culture because it was too vague, not specific enough. But then without it, it's very hard to reference a whole lot of complex practices. So I've just put a definition here of culture from UNESCO. So culture is the whole complex of distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual, emotional features that characterize a society or social group. It includes not only arts and letters, but also modes of life, the fundamental rights of the human being, value systems, traditions, and beliefs. And I think related to what Beatrice was talking about too, how is gender related to culture? I mean, it could be related in multitudinous ways, but gender, just like ideas of race or ethnicity, functions as another organizing principle for a society because of the hugely significant cultural meanings that are given to being male or female. And I think this is most evident in looking at the gender division of labor. So the ideas of women's work and men's work, which I think Beatrice talked about quite a lot in relation to access to water issues. But I think you can see it across the board. It's pretty universal in terms of those cultural norms and those gender norms around labour as well. So I think in terms of development work and innovation, I think it's quite easy sometimes to think of cultural values as being relatively static. So even the idea of cultural norms sort of implies that it's been like this forever and it will be like this and it's very hard to change. But I think to some degree they are always, to varying degrees, but they're always continually being reinterpreted in response to new needs and conditions. So some values do become more entrenched, I think, specifically if they're threatened from the outside or if people feel like something is being imposed upon them. But then other times others are actually challenged, other cultural values are challenged and seen as no longer appropriate. So I talk about that with my students in terms of cultural practices that are adaptive and cultural practices that are maladaptive. So at what point does something actually just stop being beneficial? It is actually preventing the improvement of a particular practice or condition, environmental condition or health condition, etc. And from what I've understood from development projects, it seems that efforts to reshape values about women and gender relations have focused on concerns such as the number of girls sent to school, so the rates of education, women's access to paid work, and public attitudes to domestic violence, just to name a few focus points of development work. I think, like, again, this reminds me too of what Beatrice was pointing to as well, just around the difficulties of some of the how you can actually bring risk to women sometimes when you're trying to, specifically coming in from the outside, like it's a very delicate balance of how you can empower them but also not put them at risk within their own societies as well. So I think changes in gender relations are often highly contested because they have immediate implications for everyone, women and men. So whenever you're trying to, alter discourses around gender and what's expected and what's allowable and what's normal. So as we've seen throughout history, there's many examples of where women have been huge symbols, really powerful symbols of cultural change or cultural continuity. So I think women are often seen in terms of development as, like, the whole rhetoric is that women are the ones that we should be empowering because they're the ones that will continue the culture on, etc. Which I think is useful, but men should also not be forgotten in that discourse either. But just that final point there, in such contexts, internal efforts for change become even more complex, as those advocating change can easily be dismissed as unpatriotic, irreligious, or tainted by the West. So I'm pointing at there just the risks to the women themselves, women or men themselves, in that particular culture by kind of outside imposition of, these are the values that I think are universal, apparently universal, and are values that you should live by, and da 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 da. So I think in the application of development projects, I think that's a really important consideration. Just about the unseen sort of implications of pushing communities in a certain way and changing gender norms in a certain way. So I just wanted to raise this question as well about, are development initiatives culturally neutral? So obviously development initiatives, like a lot of work that Rotary does as well, or by governments, NGOs, development agencies, are really trying to promote social and economic change. Some initiatives aim to change the values and practices that shape social relations. So family planning would be one of those. Development models also incorporate cultural values. So in transitioning communities to market economies, or trying to encourage the idea of private property, for example, the ownership of private property, like all of these things are cultural values as well. And then you have other types of initiatives that don't really seem that concerned with culture necessarily. But I think this is also something that, people working in development, they're very aware of too, but that whole, the impacts that these other types of initiatives can potentially have on social relations. So I've just put an example there of new roading as a development project, so that might be seen as culturally neutral. So it's sort of seen as basic infrastructure that human communities need to function and to transport goods and all of these things. But over a long-term period, you can see how new roading actually can change social relations themselves. So it could lead to an increase in rural-urban migration to start off with, which in turn could also result in more households where men are absent and women take charge of farms and families, or depending on the region, women leaving villages for employment in urban areas. So just that question, can it be said that there has been no intervention in local culture or no impact on gender relations? So I think this is obviously going on all the time. And again, it reminds me of what Beatrice was talking about too, in terms of the gender disparities of the men. I think it was what you were saying, Beatrice, of the men being away at work, and then more women needing to be in the household, or they're the only ones that are available to kind of look after certain aspects of the house, etc. So all of that is obviously related to infrastructure and what's available, and what level of mobility is there, etc. So it's fair to say that even a seemingly culturally neutral development project would probably have some kind of impact there. And again, this question of, can development initiatives be gender neutral? So again, even if gender is not really considered, it will probably have some effect on gender equality decisions made in the planning process of a development project. So again, as Beatrice was saying, a community-based rural water supply initiative, it could include efforts to involve women as well as men in the whole identification and management of the issue. But if it doesn't do that, then as Beatrice was saying, the strategy reinforces the idea that decision-making is a male function, or that's what the males are in charge of, and only really reflects the priorities and perceptions of men in the community. A governance initiative concerned with the reform of the Civil Code of Civil Law could include research and public consultations on the equality implications of provisions on marriage, divorce, property and marriage, or it could not, in which case it ignores an opportunity to review aspects of the civil law that in many countries institutionalizes discrimination against women. So I think it's firstly recognizing even the subtle impacts that a development project might have on cultural patterns, but also, specifically the gendered aspects of those cultural patterns as well in that implementation. So obviously in this whole process, cultural sensitivity is really, really crucial. And recognizing that decisions about what aspects of culture and tradition to protect and which to change are not really for outsiders to make necessarily, but this is not always an easy thing to manage. Assuming a role in protecting cultures from changes in gender relations is an outside imposition as much as the imposition of change based on our own cultural values. So I think that's a very difficult thing to do, really, in a way. Like, it seems good in theory, but I think when you're coming as an outside, whatever discipline you're in, I think it can be hard to step outside of your presumptions about what you think is best in any given situation, or a particular technology that's been used in one culture for a very long time, and then applying that into another is not without its complications. And so I think it's really important that you consult with, obviously, with the people in the community first, and learn how they're trying to redefine that issue to start off with. So constructing a really good dialogue with partners, and more than that, developing a deeper understanding of gender and power relations within the culture itself. So this is where ethnography comes into it. So what I've read of development projects, a lot of projects to empower women often use quantitative indicators to measure the outcomes. So a lot of numerical data around how, increasing the rates of access to but often relying solely on quantitative methods obviously can't get at the deeper social processes and emotional dimensions of cultural practice. So the qualitative really should complement the quantitative. And I have seen that increasingly in a lot of development reports on certain issues that are coming out, where the researchers are very much taking the qualitative seriously as well. But I think in terms of measuring the effectiveness of development projects and whether, social change is actually happening and to what degree, whether it's making gender issues more entrenched or whether it's actually, enabling change to happen. I think the idea of quick data gathering visits to villages on very low budgets and very tight deadlines can obviously never really accurately assess the type of intervention that's likely to transform women's lives. So that's more, in terms of the disciplines, that's very much more of a sociological approach in some way, in a sense, because it's much more about, their method is much more about surveys, about collecting data from as many people as possible. But often it lacks the depth that you get from a long-term, being able to be with a community for a long time, for long-term research. So I think from my perspective, I don't quite know how you would implement this, but from my perspective, I think that there's a really important role for the ethnographic approach in finding out qualitative experiences and realities on the ground, so not just a quick survey. So this idea this emphasizes like long-term fieldwork, immersion, participant observation, and lots of interviews with the people that you're hanging out with. So it takes the EMIC perspective, which is the insider perspective. I think this is an interesting point too about how whether organizations, whether they're already doing this, but should ask women how they would measure their own change. So rather than people coming in from the outside having implemented a project, but also coming back to then assess the impacts, but making that whole process of assessment and change, etc., very, very internalized, and having women themselves contribute to say, actually, this is how we know that something's happening, something's changing because blah, 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 blah. So giving a more specific insider perspective to that process. But in terms of implementing projects and coordination between projects in different countries, often, obviously, few donors have the money or the patience for long-term qualitative research. So that's just not really a realistic part of the implementation process of development projects, unless you're sticking with a community for a really long time and overseeing the implementation of something, which I know is an aspect that Rotary is concerned about too, like in terms of putting funding towards projects where they know that it's going to be managed and monitored in that particular zone. So I guess I wanted to, so I'm very much coming from this ethnographic perspective, but I wanted to ask a couple of questions just in terms, the first one, what are your thoughts on how projects could be better implemented in order to create lasting improvements in terms of gender relations or gender recognition of all genders? And does long-term ethnographic research have a place in development projects or in the world of development, the implementation of development? So I will leave that there, and maybe we can have a quick discussion about those thoughts.
So I'm really left with really a lot of impressions. I think you're right. There's really nothing that we do that's not culturally neutral or gender neutral. I think when we walk into a project, there are impacts. And sometimes we have a tendency in the West to sort of brush by that and sort of ignore that. And even in our best intents, and even with the idea of saying we're going to empower women.
Yeah.
It's a patriarchal society, as you mentioned, that could have detrimental effects to the women because the men feel left out, the men feel threatened. So it seems to me that somehow, and I think this is something that Nancy Gilbert and Bruce and I discussed, a participatory method in the beginning as part of the need assessment analysis.
Yeah.
That you would include this qualitative element to it, which gives it sort of a cultural sensitizing, but with the volunteers who really need it, the Westerners really need to understand that kind of atmosphere they're working in, as well as the users. In some way, there's this kind of get to understand each other session prior to doing a needs assessment, so that you can approach it a little more holistically, really understand kind of where you need to go. And I think you're right. I think that on a sustainable project, you've got to understand those cultural realities, or you're going to have problems.
Tiffany, one of the things I picked up on, it kind of ties back to something we've talked about in other sessions, is an example of when we leave a community and we set up a water board. And I've heard it said many times, oh, we need to make sure that half of the membership is made up of women. And everybody that's on this group all nods their heads and says, this is a great idea, we have to do that. But what I heard in your presentation is that might be pushing the envelope further than that community is ready. And it might be that having even one woman on a board like that is a huge cultural shift. So I think I think that for us, it's a great idea that it should be that way. But I think it sounded to me like maybe that's an example that we would have to talk to the community and find out where they really are in being able to accept something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think that's
Beatrice,
important. Sorry, you go.
Beatrice, what do you think?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Stephanie. This is quite interesting, really, and it really goes in details how we can align gender issues in our different projects, and particularly here, the WASH projects. I agree with you that many times indicators have only focused on quantitative data, and unfortunately, we can't capture the social component of things using quantitative data, the emotional issues about it. But we need the ethnographic, approaches or qualitative approaches as part of aligning our evaluation of projects, especially if we want to capture gender issues. So I really appreciate that this is quite good. Maybe the only thing is maybe in our next meeting, our WASH meeting, maybe we could come up with maybe a few specific issues whereby the projects, the WASH projects could look at before they implement the projects. How will they evaluate the gender issues? What qualitative indicators are they going to look into? And then so that at least they know where they are coming from and where they are going to. And to be honest, this is not very clear in most of the projects as such. And just as Bruce said, most of the times we just say, okay, let half of the committees be women. But that really doesn't give us a true picture of really whether gender issues are changing. Because, it could be half of the people women, but women may not even say anything. So still the men may still take lead in the decisions which are happening. So that's why we really need some qualitative data as well. So at least if we can have a tool of a sort of a building capacity or training our WASH projects to say, okay, at least if we can look at these basic issues, basic steps or indicators, qualitative indicators to see whether we are shifting from where we have started and at the end of the project. So maybe that could just be one of the things which we might just need to make it a bit more streamlining to what we are doing. But otherwise, I really appreciate this. What you have presented can capture so many things in terms of gender-based violence. We can also look at it because right now, almost all social projects now have to address issues of gender-based violence. So based on the tools which you have, the model which you have shared with us here, we can sit down and think to say, okay, how can we integrate and how can we monitor and how can we evaluate if there is any gender-based violence in terms of WASH in this context, in terms of capacity building from what you have presented here. Maybe we can think of what capacity building issues can happen in terms of gender, because gender, as you said, is quite a fluid thing, it's quite complex. So, but at least we can say, okay, maybe these are the specific areas whereby the implementers of the projects should focus on in terms of a capacity building relating to gender. So I really appreciate most of the aspects which you have presented, which is quite detailed, and it's quite good if we can put it in just a more clear way. It can really show us some effectiveness of the WASH development issues which we are taking on board. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice. I really appreciate your insights, particularly like Well, all of you are all very experienced practitioners, you know, in development work in various ways. So yeah, it's very it's good to hear that it made some made some sense. But yeah, I agree in terms of being more specific. It would potentially be a good direction to go in to actually outline and be more targeted in terms of, yeah, what are the parameters and the measurements and the ways of assessment that we as a club would recommend even for, you know, development projects going forward. Yeah. So, I agree.
Well, again, I think that we've been talking about the needs for a needs assessment analysis, and working with the user group. And I really think that if you can develop some sort of structure of developing at least the beginning of a conversation on the ethnographic implications of things before you begin to talk about other solutions and what have you. I mean, usually needs assessment analysis, you bring a multidisciplinary team in anyway.
Yeah.
And you sort of go into a participatory workshop. And part of the thing, and I guess for me, I'm mentally kind of thinking about what this might look like. It might be a role-playing kind of a sensitivity workshop in between the villagers, the men and the women, to begin to then understand the value of women's decisions because they are the stakeholders. How do you get to sensitize men, get them kind of step down from that patriarchal structure to understand that certain things got to get done. I mean, unfortunately, I'm speaking as a guy, right? But I do understand the problems. I mean, I've walked into a patriarchal setting where you know that the women are the true stakeholders, and they're the ones that really value what's being done. And every time a patriarchal head assigns a valuable role to a man, that guy kind of leaves the scenes really quickly and nothing gets done. But the women really feel like they need to get things going. But the issue really is how do you change that paradigm, I mean, how do you really get these people to understand the need of being a little more inclusive in the decision-making process? So it would be really good to see some sort of structure that, as part of a needs assessment analysis, that maybe there's a module that not just at the pathogens and the resources of water and all that sort of sanitation, what the issues are, but also the cultural realities of what you're working in, and how do you begin to move that, the ball so it begins to be something that's more sustainable in the long run. You know what I'm saying?
Yep. No, I can hear what you're saying. Yeah, even if that was something that Beatrice and I and Jessica, or collectively a group of us, could work on together in terms of developing a potential module, like you say.
Right.
Yeah, that could be an aspect of, part of the process of, the implementation of WASH projects potentially.
Right.
I think I'm hearing you. I'm just going to, I turned off my video, so I'm just going to, well, I don't see the video, so I'm just going to stop the share screen, and if I can. There we go.
There's something of an irony here in as much as with a lot of projects being led, at least nominally, by men, for men to empower women is potentially patronizing to the nth degree. In other words, women can only be empowered if men let them, and that's just undermines the whole enterprise. So it's very difficult. Like Rob, I feel somewhat uncomfortable even trying to address the issue, particularly since my sister was the chief executive of the Ministry of Women's Affairs in New Zealand for 7 years. And she just fought this attitude from within the New Zealand Public Service for years, and it's quite difficult, and it's almost the water people are swimming in.
Yeah, in a way. I think if you're in a participatory setting where you actually become a facilitator and you begin to let the natural leaders bubble up, the village or the users that you're working with,
Mm.
that you almost take a neutral position, that you're helping them move to a solution, and that's more than just the technology. That's also the social structure, how this holding is managed, and all that. I mean, that's part of the workshop. And the question really is how do we empower the village? So we're really just neutral facilitators. So the way that you and I are, I mean, we are sort of, we're quite frankly, we're initially seen as being the guys who are doing things. But the question is, how do you move yourself into a neutral position and get the villagers to take ownership and take the lead? And all you're doing is providing a toolbox and helping them reach a decision.
Mm. Yeah.
I believe Moses is participating, and I don't think he's talking. He's been sending a lot of chat that I think is relevant. I'll go ahead and read his the chat that he sent. My thoughts are using the community bylaws where women are given 40 to 50% of the positions on a committee. This is working in Uganda, and I guess this is a Rotary district. Women take up the treasury roles. The second one, women participation needs to be part of a checklist. The third bullet, involvement of young people, girls and boys in the project can change the result. The fourth, empowerment of women in property rights is in our projects can tip the balance. Ethnographic research can have a place in Rotary projects, especially the universal access to WASH model, as we are doing in Uganda, the collaboration with WASH NGOs. So that is the comments from Moses. I think that kind of parallels what we've been talking about, though. This is pretty much things we've touched on.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I was thinking about, the demographics of Tiffany's school, having women from Afghanistan, and you can't really force feed your ideas to a culture, or, whether it's an issue of religion or whatever it is, because you can actually threaten the women by doing that. You might put them in a position where the men are doing it so much that there's a huge negative effect. So again, part of this really is, I mean, you move in that direction. The question is, how do you get the users to move with you, or how do you, so that this is it's seen as being relatively, again, gender benign. It's that. It's valuable. It's gender benign. We're all together working for a valuable solution, and we're not threatening anybody. We're trying to make it work. So, I think what Moses is saying is good for Uganda, but it jumps into a solution fairly quick. The question is, how do you move in that direction? Because sometimes you'll run into a lot of obstacles because you're actually going against, cultural norms. And you got to kind of push beyond them.
Yeah, the interesting thing, I think, Tiffany, you were also talking about measuring improvements. I think that'd be an interesting thing to, if there was a way to quantify, as an anthropologist, you probably know more about it. It's hard for me to picture how you quantify changes in culture, but the idea isn't necessarily to shift the culture immediately to where people think it should be, but to move it in the right direction. And if you can have the measurable change would be, a lot larger percentage of participation of women in leadership roles, whether that was on a water committee or whatever it happened to be. If that could somehow be quantified, that would be a good thing to do. And it might not get where we want it to be or where we think it would be, but that's really, I think one of the things you mentioned, that's based on kind of the Western values that, of course, this is the way it should be, but not everybody sees it that way. And by trying to come in and force that on someone may cause a negative effect. So it's a big issue what you brought up. I think it's not what I've said this before. I thought, all we have to do is get enough wells and treatment facilities and latrines in these villages and then it'll be solved. But it's so much more than that. That's definitely the case.
the other thing I was thinking about, as Chris was talking about, is that if you're talking about scaling a project up, the scalability, kind of increase that scale, even the issue about the cultural impacts have to have scale too, and how you culturally sensitize the next community. You might have your community working really well with you, but as you begin to look at scaling things up, you got to take that same model and move it to the next group. And the question is, how do you transfer that? How do you transfer that whole social model as well as everything else?
Yeah,
really
really. Sorry.
Really interesting, kind of impacts.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a very, very delicate process in terms of it's all very well creating short-term change, but it's that long-term change that is internalized by that community, and like you say, then able to be passed between generations and entirely normalized. Like even just around the simplest thing of how we relate to our water system, which always strikes me traveling through South Asia, and probably you've all seen this as well. It always just strikes me as how can you be okay with, like, it wouldn't take much even just to remove the rubbish that's sitting in the waterway, and yet no, not like people continue to throw things in the waterway, but yet on the one hand it's very holy and sacred, and then on the other hand it's just treated like, and that's a cultural norm as well, but that's what I'm getting my students to question too, as to this environment that you're growing up in. Like, why do you think people do treat the environment on the one hand in this way, but on the other hand, does that come out of social circumstance or a lack of resources, and these kinds of questions? The long term and short term is a challenging one.
I think that the way that things end up becoming a part of the culture is when people see that it works better.
Yeah.
That's I think where, boy, this is not a bad idea. Whatever it is that's brought in that turns out to be something that actually is functional, was more likely to catch on as a part of their culture.
Yeah, I guess I'm still left with the idea that the volunteer, a culturally sensitive and volunteer, that's sort of a neutral facilitator, and it's trained to be that way. And so we have a tendency as we do projects, we need to take the role and show them the way. And the reality is we don't really necessarily know the way, because we're actually coming in with our own cultural biases, and we don't understand the cultural implications or social or religious or economic, whatever it is, of that region. And the idea basically is to get to go in there and understand. And I guess I'm really trying to grapple with your initial premise, and that is, how do you get that sensitivity towards the ethnographic realities of the location you're in, and so that you actually are able to make a project sustainable. And you only go, even on a needs assessment analysis, you might be there for a week at most, and then you're back in your Western environment, right? And then the villagers are gone. But and you're beginning to think for a solution about that thing. But the question is, how can we quickly at least begin to understand how to begin to navigate through the project, even on a cultural basis? That's a tough one.
Yeah, I think the idea, like at AEW, certainly the idea is that women are going back to they're coming into this relatively neutral sort of environment where they're free to express and critique and to reflect back on their own cultural norms, but they're from these places, and then they're going back to their home countries as spokespersons, as change makers. This is sort of the ethos of the place, and people are more likely to listen to someone who comes from, they're from there, they've gone away, but they're now coming back, and they're not wanting to step all over anything, but they have seen and experienced alternative ways of doing things, and so they're able to be potentially the best, most effective change makers. So like almost like the cultural media, there's like you're talking about like a very highly sensitive to both realities in a way, to the multitudinous realities. So I think in theory that's what the university is trying to do is create women who can go back to communities all around those countries, and at local levels, implement changes in that way. And because it's women talking to other women, but then they face their own problems, obviously. You're just talking about men talking about empowering women being problematic, and then like young women in highly, highly patriarchal societies like Afghanistan, for example, trying to effect change, which is nigh on impossible in many respects, just because it's so dangerous, etc. So like I have friends of mine who are like women who are from Afghanistan who are there right now trying to look for work or working for NGOs. And there's all sorts of other concerns that come right ahead, obviously, before being able to affect any kind of change. They have to make sure they can stay alive most of the time. But yeah, these are very interesting. Like I just absorb so much from listening to all of their particular, like all their very specific challenges. And yeah, it's.
We've seen a very similar model. It's almost analogous to that in Global Youth Exchange, where the students that go in for a year. Let's say we have a student that's from an Asian country, she goes to the United States, and she has a very conservative Asian personality when she goes, and she's having a hard time adapting to the U.S. But by the time she's about midway or people move her way into exchange, she's moving more and more to be like the students she's around, the kids that she's around from the United States, which is great. But then she's got to move back to that Asian country again. And she's totally out of, by the time she gets back, she's totally out of step with her friends back in that Asian country.
Yeah.
And she's having a hard time adapting back. So I can envision your students from Afghanistan kind of in a very culturally neutral setting, feeling more and more empowered and beginning to get their roots or wings, if you will. And then going back to Afghanistan and to actually get back that cultural reality where they're at, and really running into a lot of obstacles because they're not necessarily the Afghan woman anymore. They're that other person that's kind of across two different cultures or whatever. So, and really having to kind of navigate through. What might be really good for you is when you bring those students back, if they come back to the school in Bangladesh, is have a sit down and talk to them about how they make that transition from a culturally neutral place like a school in Bangladesh, goes back to where they're at, and comes back again and say, this is kind of how I had to adapt, and here's my realities. That'd be a really interesting tool. We do like a post-exchange evaluation. It's a setting, and we go back. As soon as we come back, we'll talk about everything from just reverse culture shock and being back to the States and all that after being abroad, to just other things. So the idea basically is if there's a way of using the information you get back to students that have been to your culturally neutral environment, and then have to go back, and then come back and at least give us more of an idea of what's it like. It might be a really valuable tool. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that made sense. I think that's I've had those conversations informally, just with students, but it would be good to, even have a focus group session or something on that process of how they negotiate. Operating within those different value systems would be quite an interesting discussion to have. Yeah. It'd be really valuable. I can just see that Moses is posting some more questions on the chat there.
Do you want to read them, or you want to?
I can I'll see if I can answer them. You mentioned a core function of the university, poverty and conflict. What are the trends there in Chittagong? Tiffany, in about 4 different WASH projects in East Africa, I've noticed a coalition of WASH challenges versus an increase of fistula condition in women, especially young girls. Is this similar in Bangladesh? I can't really comment, Moses, on that second question about the fistula condition. I'm not particularly personally aware of that. I know that I have heard public health students mention that particular problem, but I don't know of the statistics or the rates or the treatment of that necessarily. The first comment, a core function of the university, poverty and conflict. So, I mean, it's Chittagong. There's a very, very wealthy people in Chittagong. It's not all. It's not everybody in dire poverty necessarily, but the university, if I get the central idea of your question, the university is really set up to provide students that are coming from low-income families to give them a chance at an undergraduate education. So all of them are on scholarships to come there. The university is philanthropic. It functions on donations at the moment. So yeah, so that's kind of the target group, I guess, demographic that it's set up for. Yeah, I don't know if that answers. I think your questions are a bit bigger than that, but yeah.
Okay, does anyone else have any questions for Tiffany?
Very good discussion.
Yeah, this was really good. I think as we have more of these forums, you kind of mentioned it, Tiffany, that we can kind of get a group together. And I think the point that you know, Rob is making about, and Chris and myself, about what does a male do about these things? There's definitely a male role in fixing the problem, but
Absolutely.
I think that the ideas that you have to kind of bring together, from my point of view, most of this I would have never known. I would have been the person who would have gone into a village and not thought about any of this. And so I think that the role that we can play as a club is to bring the questions in front of more Rotary clubs who are doing this type of work and raise that awareness. And I think you were even talking about maybe a checklist of some sort. What are the issues that that a club should think about, and be, you know, well beyond even the specific, you know, engineering type challenges and medical challenges. I think those are pretty well known, but the cultural challenges are harder to understand and probably at least as important, if not more so, towards this concept of sustainability, because it has to become part of the culture to become sustainable. And I think that's what I'm kind of picking up from this.
Well, again, you know, Neil kind of brought that up in his conversation with us too. Is that you know, it's more of a management issue than a technology issue. So it's how do you begin to do things? And I think it's more than just being a man. I think it's being a Westerner. You know, coming with Western values into a place that really has totally different cultural realities or whatever beneath that, and trying to force feed your ideas there. And I think the idea basically is there's a cultural sensitivity that you've got to get into and understand. And the question is, how do you begin to sensitize the volunteers, whomever they are, about the realities of the location they're in, and then begin to find ways of becoming more and more of a facilitator rather than kind of force feed something, and then getting the community involved. And even at that place, it's not just going, you know, full steam into getting the community involved, but there's a sensitivity side because you kind of know where you want to go in a way. The question is that community there emotionally, mentally to do that? You know, or do you have to have some sort of sensitizing within that community about each other and roles and who's taking more value, and who are the players in the room? Find some way of doing some role play, some way of finding out who are going to be the actual implementers of the program. And a lot of that's actually, if you're in a patriarchal situation, a lot of that is get guys, the men, to understand the women's role, the value of the women, because they are the stakeholders of the family. You know, that's our bias right now, right? You realize that the women are the stakeholders. They're the ones that are really, you know, they're representing the families. They've got their heart and soul into successful. The question is, in a cultural environment, a social environment, how do you move that ball if it's patriarchal? How do you move that ball within that without being threatened? That's huge. that could make a break the project.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Beatrice, I'm curious about your thoughts about this as well. What, in your experience, because you've had a lot of experience in Africa, yeah, working with women and.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't really catch, I can't hear the mic of Bob very well from this side. I don't know why. So most of the things I was failing to catch really.
Okay.
If
Yeah, no, that's okay. He was just commenting about how you negotiate that balance of wanting it to instigate change, but not putting anybody at risk in the process.
yeah, I think the thing is what you mentioned, that consultative process of approaching everything. The women and the men both should be part of the consultation process, not just the women only. So in that way, at least there will be no sort of blame culture to say, okay, oh, women, what do you want to be? Do you want to be like us? Are you after the West culture? You know, if men are part of the process, it would be, I mean, it becomes much better. So also looking at who are the informants in the communities, what are the key decision makers. Usually people like church leaders are quite respected, and also some traditional leaders as well. So in such programs targeting, as I talked about capacity building, we might as well focus on how can the church leaders, these informant leaders, whether they are church lead involving all the community decision makers, or we call them the entregates, the leaders, to involve them to be able to understand what is the problem, using participatory approaches. Once they understand what is the problem and why should they change, then it can easily become part and parcel of them, or part and parcel of the culture as such. So the whole thing really focuses on the participatory approach to managing the process and evaluating the process, involving them, other than just a top-down approach to say, okay, this is the problem women are facing in this community, can you sort it? It will not work like that. But once they are part and parcel of it from the word go, especially the leaders, because the leaders have a final say, it could become much better. But as you said, Daphne, it becomes more expensive when we involve communities to that extent. So it also, because you have to do a lot of capacity building, a lot of follow-up, a lot of monitoring. They have to be part of the monitoring process, whether things are improving or whether things are not improving. And if they are not improving, what should be done? So it becomes a bit more expensive than a top-down approach. But that's one of the strategies which is normally used in such complex issues.
Well, in a way, it might be more expensive at a short-term view, but if you're getting projects that are moving very quickly in the wrong direction, in the long term, those are more expensive because you're actually building projects that fail, right? You're spending money that's not going to work. So the question really is are you going to put your money up front to actually do the correct problem seeking and actually understand what problems are and how to build a program that's sustainable? Put your money up for that versus going, ripshot over this, bowling through it, assuming it's going to fail. But yeah, it was cheaper, but long term, it's just not working. And quite frankly, that's one of the problems that Rotary started to notice, if I understand correctly, that they've had a lot of projects in the past that have failed because they're not sustainable. So what we're trying to do is build a sustainable model, and we're recognizing that in order to do that, you've got to do the legwork up front, not just on the technology side, but also on the social, cultural side too. management side, all those elements.
Yeah. I just wanted to comment that I don't know what our position is, what is our next step about this, but I was thinking we could focus on maybe one pilot project focusing on how gender can be streamlined. Particularly, I'm more keen about, if possible, on urban sanitation. Urban sanitation for the urban poor is becoming an emerging concept now. If we look at the new sustainable development goals, they are focusing on that as well. And actually sanitation now, it seems even the donors are going towards that, because what they are realizing is that there are so many, in the big cities now which are growing, in developing countries, the issue of slum areas in terms of sanitation has been neglected. So looking at the role of women in the urban poor in terms of sanitation could be quite an interesting area, because that's what I see that most of the approach is going towards that now. So I don't know, but we can think about it, but maybe we could try something like that. If you don't mind, I can present something about urban sanitation next time when we meet. Maybe see how we can incorporate gender. Maybe we could have maybe one project somewhere in a city which has a slum area. A slum area is where the poor people live who have, who cannot make ends meet. They don't have, they are very poor sanitation, premises. For example, maybe 3 families might use one pit latrine. So there are issues which are issues of sanitation around that, which needs to be, globally, it's being realized that they have to address that. So maybe it's something we can have a look, we can think about it as well. And it could be interesting if we look at how could the gender issues be streamlined in maybe one of our pilot projects looking at that, so that we are not left behind completely. When things are changing globally, we are also going with the multitudes. So that was just my comment.
Mm.
Well, I definitely think that your group has a lot to chew on as far as going forward. I think the idea of doing an ethnographic, some sort of a methodology that can be used as a part of the needs assessment analysis would be great. If you could develop some sort of model. And again, if you think about doing that in a participatory environment, in a workshop setting, that'd be even better. Because I think that's kind of, at least my bias, is I think that's kind of where we're going. Is, we have been discussing about how do you get funding for the needs assessment prior to starting a project to begin with anyway. I think if you provide the tools for a needs assessment analysis team to go down, and if they have enough material to work with, that they can actually begin to do those kind of studies, then that'd be great. So I think if you, Beatrice and Jessica and everybody's in the group kind of get together, and from your conversation, how do you begin to develop a study or something that's done in a participatory environment that the volunteers can use? That'd be very valuable to realizing that other things are happening too. The way I envision this thing is it's really a multidisciplinary team going down. And while some individuals might be looking at where the pathogens and where the water resources are and all that, another group is still off and work more on the social side and things like that. And other people working with potential partners and who's there right on the ground that you actually work to team up with. But it's actually you're collecting data to begin to mold the product you like, and in a very general sense. In other words, this is a generic approach, but something that can be actually used by a team. So that'd be better. As far as taking this conversation and taking it to the next level, it would be very valuable. We kind of keep working on it.
Yeah, no, thank you, Rob. I'd be very interested in helping, to put something like that together. So yes. Yeah.
The ball's in your court.
Okay.
Okay, guys. Well, this has been very good for me. I really enjoyed it. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tiffany. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.